very nice and meaningful. Also because that was the time when I started learning guitar that year in Israel. There was a lot of kind of like chilling, hanging out, playing guitar. I just kind of started that way. And then also in that children's hospital, me and my friend, we were like singing with the kids a bit. It was very nice. And that was then also the time, so my aunt and uncle who live in New York City, my aunt is American, and they, I think around that time, I mean, shortly before that, they basically, they went into retirement early, were in banking, so they could afford that, and they started doing work with J Street. And this was actually their first trip. They went on a delegation for J Street to Israel and then had a trip to Hebron, to the occupied territories, with Breaking the Silence. And they asked me whether I want to come. And so I came, and I think my best friend from Vienna was visiting also at the time, who had lived in Tunisia, and she spoke a bit of Arabic. She was very interested in also in the conflict and so on and so forth. Actually, me and her, we did already know a bit about the conflict because we held a presentation, like 1 hour presentation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in high school right before graduating. So right, I already knew a bit when I was there, but this was really the moment that I kind of started to grasp it more deeply and really, I mean, even just understand how this occupation looked like, how it worked, what it means for there to be settlements. Kind of, this experience of the way I describe it is, it was kind of a sense of temporal disjuncture. It was the sense of I'm 10 years too late in a way, because I had expected. I mean, the way I envisioned Hebron was a lot of people and a lot of like soldiers and I don't know, like Palestinians and Israelis kind of like against each other and a lot of commotion. And then you get there to Shuhada Street and it's shut down. And they're like, yeah, the street has been shut down since 2002. And it was the sense of, I'm living in like a different time period. I'm living my mind is in the 1990s, where I'm like thinking of a different, and I feel that way still, that a lot of people who I have discussions with, long political discussions, they live in a different time period, they maybe live in the 70s or in the 90s And so this was really kind of like facing the facts more clearly. And it was a really shocking experience for me. And I remember also that night when I was in the hotel room and I called my parents and I was basically crying and saying like, why didn't you tell me? Which was maybe not fair, because they didn't necessarily like, they didn't tell me otherwise either, but it was kind of also just directed, towards the movement and a lot of really propaganda that I had grown up with. And I think that was a very, very important experience for me that first time. And then within my group of that we were together in Israel and living in the Comuna, we all started having more, questioning thoughts, I would think, about kind of the Zionism that we had grown up with. And we basically, I think I told everyone also about my experiences, and we basically approached the movement, said we want to do a tour together with Breaking the Silence. So we had to push quite a lot, but we ended up, I think now that would be more standard, because there's a lot of cooperation between the World Movement and Breaking the Silence. But this was still a bit of a different situation. We had to really push for that, also because we were funded by like Israel Agency, and it can be very messy and difficult to. And then I think the best part about that year, like relatively close to the end, that was my first political action that I was involved with, and these were people from Hashomer, from the movement. Some of whom had from abroad, who made Aliyah and were involved with anti-occupation work. This was the beginning of a collective called All That's Left, which is an anti-occupation collective. And I think this was one of the first actions. And we were kind of, we were in Jerusalem for an event by Masa, by Israel Agency. And the main keynote speaker was Naftali Bennett, who at the time was already calling for annexation of Area C and spewing racist stuff. And it was very, the idea was to have a disruption at this event. And so we met beforehand at someone's house and discussed the action and made flyers and so on and so forth. And we disrupted the event. We basically, right after Bennett started speaking, we stood up, we started chanting like diaspora Jews say Die Kibush and the occupation. We had a banner. We were immediately escorted out by security. And then the amazing thing was that we were standing outside with the flyers, and Bennett basically broke off his speech. He was very cool at the moment when it happened. He was saying something like, "Oh, here you see, Israel is such a democracy that this can happen," even though we were like, escorted out. But then he broke off his speech, which was supposed to be like 45 minutes, and everyone came outside. And then we were just handing people flyers, and we had like 40 minutes time of discussing with people and like, what is the occupation and why is, and things like that. And this was an amazing experience. I mean, it was just a very good action. And I think that was such an important experience for me, to have this feeling of like, oh, wow, I can organize and this is exciting and I have an impact and change the course of history. At the time I was also a bit more naive maybe, but and this was also really a moment when I started to, this really kicked off for me a whole long, several year-long, I think still up until today, process of questioning and also unlearning a lot of the narratives that I had grown up with. But at that moment, it also really clicked for me, this sense of urgency, which I think I still have today, about the occupation and so on and so forth. And after that, so relatively shortly after that, I moved to Amsterdam, and then already I knew that I wanted to be active, politically active, and be an activist. So that was kind of also, I think, the action and the experience of having such a successful action was really important for me.
So I'm curious at what point you sort of discovered these Yiddish revolutionary songs that you know. I don't know if that's the first, if that's the correct link, but I'm curious how you got there.
That was actually the correct link. Yeah, they were specifically the revolutionary songs actually that I think the first time I heard kind of Yiddish song recordings in general, this was also around that time. I was already living in Amsterdam, but I think I came to Vienna to visit, and it was, I think, even like a Hashomer thing. We went to, they had a skiing camp every winter, and we as the kind of alumni just joined. So my group joined, and I think I was in the car with my friend, and he put on some tracks of Zupfgeigenhansel, which is one of the main like German bands that did Yiddish songs. They have an album of Yiddish songs, and the first song that I heard there was Arbeitslose Marsch. So I really loved that also because I was having this big also revolutionary ideas, and yeah, that was a wonderful song that immediately got me. But there was also Donna Donna that I just thought was really beautiful, that I hadn't known actually. That was also on there. Those were the two songs actually. And then, it was while I was living in Amsterdam, and the way I conceive of it now is it's very much, I came there, I wanted to become politically active. I was also at the moment trying to work through a lot of these very conflicting feelings that I had from my year in Israel. And the left in Amsterdam, I would say, is very kind of like, it's very decolonial, it's very anti-imperialist, it's definitely very, very critical of Israel and Zionism. And I quickly kind of understood that there were certain things that just weren't so compatible. But But I also just became an anarchist, honestly. I mean, I joined these squatting, I joined this squat, kind of like a cultural center where I volunteered for cooking and for cultural organizing, and they were all anarchists, and I fell in love with someone who was an anarchist, so I kind of it didn't work out, but I became an anarchist. We're still very good friends. It was just kind of, and through that, I also just kind of thought states, who needs states? That's stupid. And also through that found a bit more also about Jewish anarchism. I mean, it was also, I think that all kind of happened at the same time when I heard the Arbeitslose Marsch, then I found Daniel Kahn's version on YouTube, kind of having this more also through his English translation, understanding more, this is alive. This is not just, some old song. This is there are people who think like that, and finding Daniel Kahn's other music, that it was very diasporist. At the same time, I found out about Judas, which is this anarchist Jewish collective in London. They have a really funny website. I was reading a lot of their really funny stuff about Jewish anarchism and articles, and it was all very humorous and kind of tongue-in-cheek, anti-Zionist. That I enjoyed reading a lot of that, and then I also. Then I think I also found on YouTube, but it was mostly my Yiddish song searches were all kind of just on YouTube, certainly Yiddish revolutionary songs, kind of like that. I very soon also found the iconic recording of the Loi Polizei by Adrian Cooper and Zalman Lotic and the Workman's Circle chorus. I loved that song. I sung that up and down. And yeah, that was kind of the beginning. Then I also joined. Well, that was already 2017. I was so with Judas. I saw what they do, and then at the time I was already living in Vienna again for a year. But I found out that they organize an event called Birthwrong, which was like a diasporist birthright trip, basically. And the first one that they did was to Andalusia, and I already saw that video of that. I was like, oh, wow, that's so cool. I want to go. And then they organized another one to Marseille. So I went there. And that was an amazing experience. Also, because before that, I had just been alone completely. I was the only... Basically, I was the only left-wing Jew that I knew, and maybe one of my professors in Amsterdam, she was very left-wing Israeli sociologist and political scientist. But other than that, I really didn't know anyone. And coming to Birthwrong, that was suddenly wow, everyone is kind of... thinks very similar, and also everyone knows Yiddish revolutionary songs. And at the time, my Yiddish was really not good. I hadn't studied it at all. I just kind of put it together a bit from German and Hebrew, and just sung what I heard. It was very, very much going along that. I think maybe in Vienna there was one workshop happening around the Jewish Film Festival where there was Efim Chorny and Susanna Gergus who were teaching. I found out now that this was all kind of organized through my singing partner Esther Vrachko, who lives in Vienna. So there was all these connections, but I didn't know any of that yet. But Birthwrong was definitely, we sung a lot of songs, and I don't know, actually this was very important. I met Rachel Weston there, who was... Basically, it was take out your notebook and write down Yiddish Summer Weimar, write down Kles Canada, write down all these different places that I had no idea about. And Rachel was really cool. And I met some great people there. I mean, Joseph Finlay, who was the founder kind of Judas, who was also doing a lot with music, and Annie Cohen was there also, who was now... graduate student in New York, also, such interesting work in Yiddish. So I was also there were a lot of Yiddishists and kind of Yiddish music people and just lefty, and we joined for May 1st on the march, and there was a lot of very, very great, interesting stuff happening. And it was also just so freeing for me, this experience of kind of being surrounded by other Jewish young people who, think alike, like not all the same, but like think alike in very significant ways, and also kind of have a lot of us have very conflicting relationships to kind of the Zionist upbringing that we had. A lot of us had that and had very similar relationships. So going back from Marseille, I kind of decided, okay, I need to start something like this also in Vienna. Like I have to. And also, like at the airport, I was started to like kind of send random people messages. I sent a message to. There was this group. It's a kind of like, it's somewhere between J Street and Jewish Voice for Peace. An organization that exists in Germany. And I wrote to them and asked, "Oh, do you know anyone in Vienna?" And the person who replied was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm in Vienna, actually. I used to live in Berlin, but now I live in Vienna." Ruth is her name. She's a good friend. And she, at the time, we basically started a collective together in Vienna that has been running for a couple of years. And it was, at first there was just no one. Like I was just kind of feeling I'm alone, and then slowly you find more and more people, and it just kind of slowly grows, and it's all based on kind of diasporist ideas. It's not necessarily Yiddishist, but the different connections of what people are interested in culturally and politically. But that kind of started also through that. I forgot what was the question. Now I'm kind of like.
Well, originally we were talking about how you got to the Yiddish revolutionary songs, which
that's.
But I guess before we go back to that, I'm curious sort of whether there are particular identities or sort of labels that you identify with currently that you want to name or not.
Currently, like in what way you mean?
Well,
identities?
You've mentioned like Yiddishism or like Yiddishist, diasporist. I'm curious if there are particular.
Right. Okay, I would say definitely identify with diasporism a lot. Yeah, I think a lot about that. It's funny. Like I named my album Millennial Bundist. I also identified a lot with Bundism. I think maybe a bit less now that I'm like, there are different ways of being diasporist.
And can you just say what that means?
What diasporism means for me? Yeah, so it means that I believe that Jewishness is very much something that is rooted in the experience of diaspora, which doesn't necessarily mean everything outside Israel, but like also, in my view, Israeli culture is also, should be kind of re-diasporized in mentality of kind of considering the ways that there's so many different diasporic histories and stories of migration and that come together. That is precisely, I think, what makes Jewish life meaningful, and it's also something that is not a national identity in the sense of kind of full belonging to an imagined community of and then being within a nation state, but rather kind of this in-betweenness. I think about diaspora itself a lot in this, of living in this tension between horizontal and vertical belonging. So kind of the horizontal would be like the rootedness in a particular place, and then the vertical belonging is kind of the belonging to like a wider community of people, but also the different traces that one's particular story has taken, So I find so much beauty in kind of this diasporic existence. And then it is very much also kind of thinking about, going against also kind of the devaluation of diaspora that has historically taken place through Zionism, through kind of this negation of the diaspora, of the rejection of the diaspora. But then also, I would say a rejection of, in my view, of all nationalism, so including Jewish nationalism, but also the nationalism. Like I'm actually more affected by like Austrian nationalism living in Austria, like Nazis there. So it's like related to each other in my view. And that's kind of what we in the collective, for example, I mean, we have like 3 principles that we decided on there. Like frei, they're actually Yiddish. We made them in Yiddish. So it's Freiheit, which is kind of like liberationist, generally for different kinds of like also social justice movements and liberationist movements, but also just Jewish collective liberation. Then one of the principles is Solidarność, which is more kind of like also solidarity with different minorities, which is something I think and care about a lot, and different oppressed groups and kind of cultivating Jewish solidarity. And the third principle is Deutschkeit, so that's kind of the direct Bundist connection. And yeah, I do think, I mean, Deutschkeit captures a lot, I think, of how I view diasporism. But it's not the only form that exists, but I think it's a really beautiful idea, also specifically in like the 21st century, where there's a lot of also belonging, is much messier than it was maybe in the early 20th century. And I think Deutschkeit really is a very meaningful way of thinking about, again, like commitment to a place, rootedness in a place, but also just commitment to people around you from different places and communities, and also a certain legitimacy of kind of local Jewish histories and local Jewish existence that doesn't all get streamlined also into kind of it's not even Israeli, like there's a difference between Israeli culture that is in itself much more diverse than the kind of, and it's not even like Zionism per se, because I think Zionism is kind of over in some ways. A lot of it is called, I would call it more like Israelism. It's just like, just a flag and an anthem, and it's like what is sometimes called like banal nationalism. It doesn't even have any depth to it, really, any in-depth engagement, which is completely opposite, I think, to Yiddish culture. And that's why I would say I also identify as a Yiddishist in that sense that I am a Yiddish scholar. I mean, I learn Yiddish. I spent a lot of time studying Yiddish. I love delving into Yiddish culture precisely because of that, precisely because it gives me this depth of also particular Jewish history and not some kind of vision of kind of one global diaspora all centered in one homeland. That's just not not what I get from Yiddish culture, even though there's also, of course, like Zionism in Yiddish culture, but it comes from a particular place, from a particular understanding and particular histories, and that's what I find really beautiful. Yeah. And then maybe in terms of like identifiers, or I think I'm more like careful with something like anarchism or socialism nowadays. I don't know, just because I'm a bit, I think, wary of some of like the very simple answers to questions. Maybe that's part of kind of becoming older a bit. It's not that I'm like changing my beliefs, but I think I'm just wary of certain like platitudes. But I definitely still identify with a lot of these ideals of different liberatory and like social liberatory movements. And then also questions like feminism. I think about that a lot still. I think of how to, be a feminist in this world and understand also my womanhood in a political way, in a politicized way. That was probably before I started thinking reflexively about Jewish identity. I started thinking about gender and being a woman very reflexively, and gender identity in general, and queerness, even though I don't identify as queer, but I just started thinking about that a lot. So I feel like I learned thinking reflexively about identity first through that, and then could think through Jewishness in that way.
Amazing. Well, I'm curious, do you want to talk about your albums? What feels like where do you want to go after this? In terms of, I was thinking we could go to, talk about Millennial, Bundist, and Soveles, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, maybe also like kind of how it started with the music. Yeah. So it was when I was living in Amsterdam that I started to learn more of these songs, also just kind of accompany myself on guitar. And then it was also when, while I was living in Amsterdam, that was also my first performances. One of the first performance was at a small university protest. That was like a tiny occupation of like a tent occupation outside on campus. And I was living really close then, and I just brought out my guitar and started playing some songs and some Yiddish revolutionary songs, and De Loi Polizei and Arbeitslose Marsch and Die Arbeiter freuen, or songs like that. And then it was evicted shortly after that. And while the police was kind of evicting the camp, we were, kind of a bit away on the other side. There was some like escalation and police brutality. And then I was also singing De Loi Polizei into like the microphone without a guitar. It was just kind of like that. But it was very meaningful to me. So it kind of grew out of protest experiences already. I then had my first concert in the squat where I used to spend a lot of time there, and that was also very meaningful, I think. And it was also funny because there were some like older kind of alcoholic people who were hanging out there a lot. There were some people who came to the squats regularly who were not like a bit kind of fell out of the social system, and they were a bit disturbing a bit the concert, but they were also just super excited because there was such a strong Yiddish history in Amsterdam, and one of the ways to refer to Amsterdam is mokum, which is comes from Yiddish Hebrew, and they were like, oh wow, it's Yiddish, and oh mokum, and I don't know. I heard afterwards that they were really excited, so that was really great. And then I did one performance also at this occupation. It was kind of like a climate justice protest because in the north of the Netherlands there's a lot of fracking, and there was this kind of civil disobedience action there. And I was scheduled to perform, but right before that there was kind of an escalation with police brutality where people were beaten and there were dogs, and it was very intense. And then afterwards we're like, oh, you're on, perform. And that was also definitely a very intense moment. And I was also, I think, performed Arbeitslose Marsch, Still die Nacht, which, was already thinking a lot about civil disobedience and like also armed struggle and different, and De Loi Polizei, which was very important at that moment, I think, very cathartic, yeah. And then I moved back to Vienna again. That was in 2018. And that's when I organized my first concert in Vienna. I just kind of, my friend was like encouraging me, and it was in a cellar of a house that belonged to a friend of mine. They had like a small cultural center in the cellar, and I just hosted an evening there of Yiddish revolutionary songs. And then shortly after that, so I created the whole program and I performed it. And then shortly after that, basically how I became a musician is I made a website. And then organized another concert, I think one more in like a small cultural center, and then maybe one other. And then from that moment on, it was just snowballing. Like since then, I barely have organized a single concert. It's just kind of evolved. I mean, there was so much resonance, and it was also kind of part of that there was so much resonance that I already decided, okay, I need to make an album like quickly. I need to basically document this. That it was a big repertoire. That was not necessarily a wide repertoire in the way that would have been if I had first studied in all these like Yiddish cultural spaces, and then it kind of emerged from like a very small like a limited repertoire from the music that I found on YouTube, or that was kind of the German language, like Zupf gegen Hansel, like what was on his CDs, what was on their CDs. So it's also some hits like Die Grüne Cousine, which doesn't usually get on a revolutionary music CD, but for me this was a revolutionary song because to be like Columbus land shall burn is pretty like that's a pretty I remember when I performed that the first time in Amsterdam, I was it was a very like anti-imperialist context also. I was like, that's a pretty cool thing to say in that sense. Also, if we think about like refugees coming and not having good living conditions and stuff like that. So for me, this was a political song. And this is like that with a lot of songs on the album. I think, if people don't have the booklet, they maybe don't understand exactly what is the context or the meaning of it. Some songs are also just on there that I just like Kinder Joren. I just like it.
Do you want to talk about the German verse that you wrote?
Yeah. So that was in that same year as 2019. That was basically when it all started kicking off, and I started to perform a lot, and also at protests. So at that time, there was a protest movement happening in Vienna, the so-called Thursday demonstrations. They were happening every Thursday, and they were happening because we had, for the second time in history also of the Second Republic, a coalition of the Conservative Party with the extreme right. And this already happened once in the 2000s. And there were Thursday demonstrations then at that time as well. They were very big movements. And so now it was like a new generation of activists who were organizing these protests. They were very like cool and hip also. There was a lot of raving and I don't know. They were like, it was a different generation, I would say. And I basically just wrote to them and said, I do protest music. Can I perform at your protest? And they didn't reply for quite a while. They have a bit of chaos. They were very apologetic about it afterwards. But like half a year later, they were like, we saw your message. We have, it's, 1st of May, and our protest is on the 2nd of May, and we're doing like an anti-work day, like kind of, do you want to do worker songs? And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do Yiddish worker songs. And then the night before the protest, I basically was inspired to rewrite one of the songs. So I rewrote the Loi Polizei for the protest. So it's not really a translation. It's, some of the verses are kind of follow the same format. And I think what inspired me was that I had the CD in Love and Struggle with Adrian Cooper and Salma Milotic and the chorus. And it said in there that this song, first of all, it's a mashup. Salma Milotic mashed up the two parts, like in Alle Gassen und the Loi Polizei, which I think fits really well. And I also took that over. And secondly, that the verses were basically kind of spontaneous. I mean, someone came up with a verse and created a verse kind of depending on the context. So I was inspired to write my own. And the verse, the chorus, so instead of the Loi Polizei, it was like, hey, hey, nieder mit HC, so down with HC, this was his initials of his first name, the leader of the right-wing nationalist party, whom I had very much also grown up with as like the enemy, because he was, at the time when I was growing up, he was becoming really big and popular. And so I rewrote the song and I performed it there, and it became a really big hit. People loved it and started singing along, and so I performed it once, and then at the end of the protest, they were like, come on stage again and perform it. And they were really into it. And then they kind of announced it as the hymn of the movement. So next week I was invited again to perform it, and they printed out text for everyone to sing along. So it was like really a big thing. I mean, these are also like big protests. And I thought, oh, great, I have a weekly protest gig now. And then 2 weeks later, this was precisely 2 weeks later, there was a video that came out of the leader of the right-wing party, Hatze Strache, on Ibiza in a villa where he was basically caught on a camera. It was like a trap, and he was caught on camera saying all these very corrupt things of how he was going to sell out the biggest newspaper in the biggest tabloid newspaper for like political favors, and I don't know, but started saying all these very very corrupt, kind of admitting to a lot of corruption. And it started this whole scandal, and he had to step down. But on that day the day after, there was a huge manifestation outside of the chancellor's office, and I was invited to come again and perform. So that day I performed it was like on top of a van. And we're like 5,000 people all around. The speakers only went to one side, so a lot of people are like, "Oh, I saw you. I didn't hear you, but I saw you." And I performed it then, and in Yiddish and in German. So I told the story. Oh, this is in Yiddish, anti-Tsarist, anti-police song, and it's a protest song, and it was also. That's kind of how it emerged, and that's how I got inspired to write it in German. And I sing Yiddish revolutionary song, so it also gave like a space for Yiddish, I think, in a context that it didn't have, and then connected it to this very to this movement. And that day also had stepped down, so it was like. I think I performed right after he stepped down, and then like changed the verse to say it's his last day and stuff like that. So there was a lot of really fun stuff related to that. And so on the album, I put, I recorded the song, and then basically the sound engineer, he mixed in the recording of that day of the protest. So to kind of, capture that a bit as well. So I kind of think of Millennial Bundist as it's very documentary also. Like I really just I didn't want to, make any changes necessarily, try to present it as something that it wasn't. And the fact that this whole project of me singing Yiddish songs, it all just started with me and a guitar and just figuring out things. I have very simple accompaniments. I'm not like performing big. I'm just singing these songs, and I think that's kind of was the idea of it. I mean, I just want to document what has happened, and that's a point in time that I have now documented, and that has also allowed me to kind of move on in a way, or like find new also artistic ways of dealing with Yiddish song, Yiddish music, and yeah.
So I would love to hear, just what you said was a beautiful bridge to what I was going to ask, which is how you came to unaccompanied Yiddish singing, and how did you encounter that tradition and get to your Soveles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because I think this is kind of like the second part of this whole story that basically just started not so long ago, and is also what I'm working on academically. I mean, this is basically the focus of my PhD that also only slowly evolved. I mean, I applied for the PhD with a project on Yiddish song, and then it only slowly evolved kind of to focus on unaccompanied Yiddish singing. But this started basically through me taking lessons. So, I mean, also another part of the story is that, I started performing Yiddish, and this whole thing with the protest and stuff, that all happened before I even really entered kind of into the community, like global community of Yiddishists and Yiddish musicians. That really started in that summer in 2019 when I went to Class Canada for the first time, and I went in the winter again to Yiddish New York. And already that summer, I knew that in Class Canada I was very excited because I knew Ethel Rehm would be teaching there, teaching the art of unaccompanied singing, and I was really interested in that. I also just I was just very interested in meeting her and hearing her. I really loved the Penny Whistler's arrangement of Mein Ruheplatz, listened to that a lot of times. And also in that year, earlier that year, I started taking lessons with Benji Fox Rosen. in Vienna, I basically just, I heard from him from a couple of angles, and I was still studying music therapy at the time in Vienna. It was a study that I started and then stopped, but I had some music friends basically were telling me, oh, you should meet Benji. Like my flute teacher was actually outside of the program, but she, and so I contacted Benji. And this was basically also the first thing we did was I came to his house and he was like, oh, sing something for me. So I sang him Arbeitslose Marsch from Gebirtig, and he sang along a bit. It was very nice. And then he was like, have you listened to recordings of like native Yiddish speakers singing Yiddish songs? I'm like, no, I've never heard that. He was like, oh, maybe I think you should listen to some of those recordings. And he showed me the CD, the Jewish Life in the Old Country, Ruth Rubin's folkway record with the field recordings, and we listened to. I think the first song we listened to was "Was willst du mit der Huben?" Was willst du mit der Huben in dialect, and yeah, it was a very interesting experience for me. And I think it was kind of this, I'm writing about that also in my dissertation and kind of working through that the role of these field recordings also, and kind of this what Ethel calls the art of unaccompanied singing, which is, the way I see it is it's a performance practice that it's not necessarily, it's kind of niche. It's like a niche performance practice that maybe, I wouldn't say it's lost, but it needs some kind of recovering, because a lot of the way in which kind of Yiddish song production has, gotten its own aesthetic within kind of the klezmer revitalization, and I feel like this performance practice has very beautiful aspects that kind of get lost a bit in that. I think the way Benji thinks about it is also a bit like a rite of passage or something, that he got this introduced to him as like a way to also connect with a certain soundscape of like pre-war Eastern Europe and musical style, and so did I. And then I studied also that summer with Ethel's class, and I did some work on that with Benji. And then during the pandemic, that was basically, so also right before the pandemic, Sveta Kundish came to Vienna for a concert, and I asked her to take a lesson with her. And then I was also like, I've been working a bit on this, like, she was basically like, I think I sang her in Droisnes Finster, and she was like, you are perfect for learning this style, you need to go to Ethel Frey, basically. But during the pandemic, then she contacted me, had a lot of time, was like, do you want to do some lessons? I said, I would love that. So we worked a bit also on that repertoire, also on other things, also some new Yiddish songs. So I think that really was the time when my horizon widened a lot. I also started at that time taking lessons also with Benji online, which was more kind of composition and setting poetry, which is something that I had encountered that winter still in New York. I went to Yiddish New York, and I was in Joshua Letsky's songwriting class that really encouraged me to this was the first song that I wrote, basically, or like poetry setting. So that I kind of evolved into different directions, which is now also basically my PhD research is on that. It is about kind of the performance practice of unaccompanied singing, plus its connections a bit to kind of new Yiddish song and Yiddish song production and different ways of conceptualizing this traditional or Yiddish folk song repertoire as something that is maybe distinct from like the theater repertoire, but can still be folklorized in a way. But and this was also the origin then of Soveles, because that was basically me and Esther Vrachko, who's been involved in the klezmer and Yiddish music scene for a long time. She basically grew up with it. I mean, her mother was in this left-wing anti-fascist choir, so not Jewish. She didn't grow up Jewish, but it was like this left-wing anti-fascist choir, and a lot of kind of this a lot of klezmer also, and she kind of grew up with going to Yiddish Summer Weimar and so on and so forth. And we were together in Class Canada. That's where we really became friends. Even though we were both from Vienna, we became friends in Canada. And then at some point in the fall, we just met and we're like, oh, do you want to sing together? And we just met to sing together. And we just sung Mein Ruheplatz, the arrangement by the Penny Whistlers. And it was very beautiful. And we're like, oh, wow, this is so nice singing together. And that's kind of how it emerged. I mean, we both... I at that moment had just been starting to encounter the kind of more this repertoire and performance practice. Esther had already learned that for many years, but also just really loved a lot of these songs and was saying, it's not, you can't really set them to you can't really make big instrumental arrangements out of them. So, and we just started to experiment with singing together. And I think what also just emerged was that we had a lot of, from the repertoire, it's very women's, I mean, it's a women's performance practice. A lot of it is very depressing stories from women's lives. One of the first songs we did that was the first song, Oi unter dem Himmel liegt die Stadt Buenos Aires, which is a song from the Ruth Rubin archive sung by Harry Ari, and it's about women's trafficking. It's very depressing. We learned it that summer at Class Canada from Ethel Rehm and arranged it and performed it at Yiddish New York that winter. And then I was like, oh, we should organize a concert. So I just organized a concert for us. It was on the 14th of February, 2020. So it was right before the pandemic. This was our first concert. We practiced a lot to kind of create, we had to create a 1 hour long program out of nothing. So we just arranged a lot of songs and performed them. And it was great. And then the pandemic happened, and then it was, we couldn't perform, we couldn't really rehearse a lot together. But then after a while, the second lockdown, third lockdown, we had a lot of lockdowns in Vienna. That other than the first, they were all a bit looser, and we, tested and met up with each other and had a lot of time also. So we just arranged new songs, and that's kind of how it emerged. And then we decided, okay, we have to record an album, and this is like my new second big project is Soveles, and it's been really nice. I mean, it's basically just Esther and me, and a lot of it is a cappella. Some of it, I mean, especially on the CD, we have some cello on there. Lily Weinhandel, who's a cellist living in Vienna, and she performed with us sometimes also, but also not on all of the songs. We have some percussion and some sound effects and everything. I think we experimented a lot with the mixing, but in general, it is kind of an a cappella project, and it's been very nice. It's been very satisfying because I feel like it's sonically also very different from what I've did before, and that's really nice to explore a different direction, and also topic-wise, different style and soundscape,
Well, I just have a couple more questions, I guess. One, I know that one of the things that you mentioned that you're studying is transmission. So I'm curious sort of how you see yourself and performing artists in relation to Yiddish transmission or transmission of Yiddish culture.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think about transmission, the way I study it, it's more related to teaching and learning. So it's more also specifically, and it's about transmission of style. So it's a lot about this question of how do people, learn to understand a style and learn to hear it, listen to it, and also then learn to internalize it. But transmission is definitely a big part of performing practice, and it's something I probably don't think about it so much in terms of that, but I think a lot about also representation. I think a lot about kind of what I represent when I represent Yiddish culture, Jewish culture, specifically also in Germany and Austria. So I also have this program together with Benji Fox-Rosen, where we work on this question of like, what do we represent when we represent Yiddish, when we sing Yiddish song on stage, like what kind of Jewishness do we represent, and what expectations of the audience do we fulfill, and what do we not fulfill? And specifically in relation to Holocaust memory, which I think is, also tying a bit, again, to kind of this experience of growing up in Vienna. I think about that a lot, also as a performer, and as a performer of specifically resistance repertoire. I think about that a lot. Kind of what does that do to the audience? What does that do? I mean, is it resistance to perform resistance songs? Maybe not, if it's like in a ritualized context that just makes everyone walk out and feel good and not reflect on. So yeah, in that sense, I think there's a lot of transmission in that sense of subtext, but also just on the level of songs. I think more just on the level of knowing about, I mean, I feel like I perform so much in contexts where people don't know anything about, maybe they know stuff about Jewish culture, but they only think about it in terms of like a religion and a religious group, and they don't know about secular Jewish culture, and they don't know about Yiddish, and they maybe don't know that it's written in Hebrew letters, or I don't know, there's just a lot of things that I feel like need to be transported, or just Yiddish revolutionary or like working class history. I mean, it's sad, but people think like there's no such thing as a Jewish working class, which is probably rooted in like an anti-Semitic belief that they're all bankers. But it's like, it's this, there are certain things, I think, there's a lot of history and culture being transmitted, other than the songs. I mean, the songs, obviously, there's certain songs that are just hits. They were always hits, and people love them. But I think there's a lot of other communication happening.
We always like to end with advice, and I'm curious, sort of given what you've talked about with your personal journeys, what advice you might have to people who are curious about the Yiddish music traditions that you are involved in. I mean, it can really be to anyone that you want, but I'm sort of suggesting maybe on that theme.
So I think my advice would be to search for community. I think that would really, or like to get connected. That was definitely something that I wish I would have learned earlier in my trajectory. Which, maybe it's also certain things wouldn't have happened if I would have been in the community before. But it's definitely been such an important factor, and I've gotten so much from being part of really a transnational community of people who care so deeply about Yiddish culture, Yiddish music, who have also similar political ideals or care about social justice and think about connections. And basically the connective bit, I think, in all of it is also just art and expressiveness. And I think for anyone who's interested in that, it's really worthwhile to seek these spaces out and learn, and basically just learn and learn and learn. I mean, that again also, I think I started before I started learning and taking lessons, and now I'm still taking lessons with Ethel Ray. I'm taking some lessons with Josh Waletsky. Like I'm also through the PhD learning a lot, and it's really it's really amazing. But I would still encourage people to go for it. It's not like they have to. It's not like you have to have a certain level before. Like I don't believe. I believe that can be a very inhibiting feeling as well, to feel like you need to, spend so and so many years studying something before doing it or performing it like that. I would say that was also my experience of just going for it, which is great. But then also to be humble and to learn and seek out the people who can teach, who have a lot to teach, because there are many people out there who do that. And it's funny because I write about this in my dissertation, but I would also encourage people to listen to these recordings of field recordings. Go to the Ruth Rubin website and just listen through them and understand. I mean, specifically people interested in any kind of Yiddish song, because it's so I feel like it says so much about performance and non-commercial, non-professional in that sense performance, but its own like Yiddish aesthetic and performance practice, and it tells you so much about just not just on the level of the text of course, but also at the level of the dialects and the dialect mixing, and there's just so much to discover, and it's really this experience of like learning to listen to these recordings and hearing different, I don't know, ornaments or the bigger picture and the phrasing to that it was really enjoyable. So I think that would be great. And I learn Yiddish, of course, and keep learning Yiddish. I mean, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.